Welcome to the Jasper Blueprint, a podcast for established business leaders wanting to build a thriving business in an uncertain market. Today I'm joined by Dr. Amy Climer to talk all things creativity.
If you don't want to be innovative, if you don't want to solve problems, that's okay. You just might not be around that long.
Yes, it's a common word, but what do we even mean by creative? Because when I think about for myself, when I was younger, if you had said, are you creative? I probably would have said no. If you said, are you artistic? I would have said definitely not. But if you'd said, are you musical? I would have said yes. Most people would actually balk at the idea of even putting themselves in that category of like being capable of being creative. Well, this is a conversation today around collective creativity, which probably two words everyone's familiar with, not necessarily familiar with them together, but looking forward to exploring this with Dr. Amy Climer, who is joining us as a person who is living and breathing this and has been for quite a while, Amy, I think would be correct to say. Amy is a speaker, trainer, coach who's focusing on creativity and innovation. Also has a podcast called The Deliberate Creative, where she shares practical advice and strategies to help leaders build innovative teams. And I think it would be correct to say that that's something all of us need and want. So, Amy, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It might actually be helpful for us to just start there. When you think of your book, which is coming out in February, and we will share some details about that in the show notes, where would you start running us through those foundational elements of this work and this idea and why it's so important for us, particularly for leaders who are managing teams and running organizations?
Yeah, sure. Great question. Okay, so the book is called Deliberate Creative Teams, How to Lead for Innovative Results. And it is for business leaders who want their teams to be more creative, but maybe don't quite know where to start with that. And the main premise of the book is that innovation does not happen by magic or by chance, that innovation is actually systematic. Yeah, I know, right? Dang. Wouldn't that be great?
It would.
But actually, in some ways, it's really nice that it is systematic because that means we have a lot more influence and we can make a difference by being intentional around it. And really, by the end of the book, if you choose to read it, and if you follow all the pieces of it, you'll have a creative team who can innovate anytime you need them to.
Most people would actually balk at the idea of even putting themselves in that category of like being capable of being creative, or, you know, what does that look like? Only some people are in that category, and I'm more of a numbers person, or we have all of these labels and notions of our identity. So that piece that you just spoke about, that's almost the freeing element of, oh, you can learn this. There are tools, there are things you can pick up on. Could we dig in a little bit more to that and maybe tap into why you think this book is important at the moment? So for people needing to realize what they can learn, how they can develop their teams, why is that something that in amongst all the other things we have to do and our busyness and being stretched so thin, why should we focus in on this at the moment?
Not everyone sees themselves as creative, and it's really important that you do see yourself as creative for two things. One, we all as humans have incredible creative potential. It's just a matter of tapping into it, understanding how creativity works, and the people who are highly creative that you know, whether they would say it this way or not, they practice creativity. There's an intentionality behind what they do. I mean, any successful artist, successful meaning they're like producing work regularly, and they all have a practice. And so that's important. And the other thing is that creativity is somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you believe you're more creative, you will produce more creative results.
Maybe can you explain, because it could also be, yes, it's a common word, but what do we even mean by creative? Because when I think about for myself, when I was younger, if you had said, are you creative? I probably would have said no. If you said, are you artistic? I would have said definitely not. But if you had said, are you musical? I would have said yes. If you said, can you write? I would have said yes. So it's kind of this piece of, we have different notions of which even fit in that category. And often it's limited to more the artistic side. So what does creativity mean when you say all of us have that ability? What is creativity?
First, let me say what it's not, which you kind of touched on, that creativity is not about your ability to draw.
Yeah,
so
good. If stick figures are the extent of my drawing.
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting is that drawing is a skill. And if you want to get better at it, you can build that skill. We in the US and maybe in Australia is the same. We don't teach that in school. But years ago, I was in India and I spent about 3 days at an elementary school. And the first day I went in, there were, I guess it was probably about second graders, and their teacher had drawn on the board this like cartoon turtle. And I'm like walking around the classroom, and every student had drawn this turtle like perfectly. And I was like, oh, this is the same as learning the alphabet. You know, like in kindergarten, first grade, you're writing the alphabet like hundreds of times, right? And so they were just teaching drawing in the same way. I'm like, oh, this is so smart. But anyway, most of us did not have that experience. And so creativity has nothing to do with your ability to draw. What it is novelty that is valuable. So this idea of novel is, original, unique, new, different, and valuable, meaning it could be financially valuable. That's usually where we go first. But it could also be emotionally valuable, aesthetically valuable. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to look at that. But all it is essentially we're solving problems. We're coming up with a unique, original solution that provides value that, therefore like eliminates the problem or whatever it is you're working on. And that's it.
Which as a definition, I think automatically makes it far more practical, and in a business setting would make people go, oh, we need some of that. It moves it out of the very unfortunate category that so many things that are foundational and critical get put in, where it's like, oh, that's fluffy or soft or not relevant to the business elements. When you talk about novelty that is valuable and solving problems, it's, oh, that sounds rather relevant.
I'm like, if you don't want to be innovative, if you don't want to solve problems, that's okay. You just might not be around that long.
IBM and their study saying that CEOs talked about creativity as the most important leadership quality for navigating the upcoming complexities facing the world. And that piece is becoming more and more apparent as we just deal with the speed of change. All of the different elements that you could previously get away with ignoring that now are very much expectations and demands on us as business leaders. You're right that, okay, you could dig your heels in and not want to approach this type of work, but good luck being competitive and staying relevant in the market.
Yeah, especially I think when unexpected things come up, like the pandemic, like where I live in Asheville, we just had a massive hurricane about 6 weeks ago that was completely, destroyed a lot of businesses and buildings, and it destroyed our entire water treatment facility. And while horrible as it has been, it's also been amazing to see like how people are responding. And there has been some incredible innovation. There's also been really awesome people coming together as a community. But I think that understanding how innovation works and creativity works helps us respond in the moment when something unexpected happens, which unexpected things happen all the time.
Well, and as you said, when you think about these elements more as tools, as skills that you can learn and develop and practice to get better at them, it takes something that can be overused words. So while creativity may not be as overused, one of the other words you reference around innovation and innovating, that word is one that gets overused and very rarely actually is referencing things that are even vaguely innovative. But taking it and turning it into those elements of how do we really intentionally think about embedding these skills, being honest about the fact that deliberate practice, moving towards mastery takes time and the repetition and some of the training and skills that are required there. If you pause for a minute around, you just mentioned Hurricane Helene and the impacts of that. What are some examples that you found in the way your brain responded to that, how you did your problem solving, how you looked at, okay, what could we do here that could help solve this problem? So the novelty that's valuable. Were there things that you could give us as practical examples, even in the responses to that disaster, that actually are perfect, pointing to your practice of this skill changed your ability to adapt to the problem?
I think I felt like I had an advantage in this situation. I mean, first of all, I will say I had a physical advantage in that my house did not get damaged.
Yeah.
So there was that. We didn't have electricity for 12 days. We didn't have running water for 17 days. But all that aside, I felt like I had an advantage because I have spent hundreds of days of my life camping. And so it was like, no electricity, no big deal. Without water, it's fine. So it felt like it maybe wasn't as hard as it was for someone who had never had experience or had very limited experience dealing with that. And I do think that's the case. Is like the more different experiences we've had in our life, the easier it is to respond, because you can pull from these other potentially unrelated experiences. Many people did, but not everyone did, is that we were well prepared. So there was some warning that, the hurricane was coming. And I actually wasn't home. I was out of town. My wife and I both were out of town at the time, but our daughter, who's 23, she lives in a little house by a creek. And the fire department came over and told her and her roommate they needed to evacuate.
Yeah.
So she left. She came to our house. And I called her Friday morning as I'm trying to get home. And I said, you need to fill up the bathtub. You need to fill up all these containers of water. And she did. And we did all those things. And that meant that for the first 48 or 72 hours before water could get in, we were fine. But there were a lot of people that didn't do that. I definitely talked to people who had the means to, like they lived in a house, they could have filled up even a few water bottles, and they hadn't done that. And so then they were in much dire straits than someone who had prepared. And so that was the first thing. It's like, okay, because I had these basics figured out, it left my brain available to be more creative and help other people.
Yeah.
And one of the just great moments of innovation that I saw, our Register of Deeds, his name's Drew Ressinger. I'm not sure how to say his name. Anyway, so one of the problems that happened is that there was no cell service for 48 hours. Thousands of electrical poles are down. Like there's no communication. So all these people from outside of Asheville and even within were trying to figure out, is my friend safe? Is my family safe? And so eventually the Register of Deeds, he set up this system where anybody could go on and online and could report someone as unaccounted for. We had 15,000 people who were unaccounted for. And so now it's a question of, well, how do we get all these people? So he and his team quickly put together this training and had volunteers, which my wife and I went and volunteered one day. We show up, we get a brief orientation, and then we're given a list of 10 people, and our job is to figure out what's going on. And so, we obviously start with a phone call to them, and then we start with a phone call to the person who made the report.
Yeah.
And if that doesn't work, we go over to their house. And that's what we did. Like we went over to somebody's house and they were like, what? We're fine. We just didn't communicate with anyone for 5 days because we can't. And we're like, cool.
We're kind of distracted. Yeah.
Right. They don't have any, cell service or whatever. But it was amazing. In this really relatively short time, it took about a week. The community was able to jump in and at least identify where 15,000 people were. Or,
Incredible.
Were there people that still were missing? And then we knew, okay, this needs to be elevated.
Yeah, I love that. So you gave us that beautiful sort of description or definition around creativity, novelty that is valuable. When we move into that innovation space, Brad, my partner, always talks about the juxtaposition of two previously unconnected things. So how do you bring these elements in? And I think the example you just gave is a helpful one too, because as we try to make these ideas more practical and okay, what would that mean in my business? Sometimes when we use, even dropping in the word novelty can make people think, oh, it's got to be this massively new thing that's completely groundbreaking. But that connecting, that juxtaposition of previously unconnected things means that the examples you gave us, that breadth of, I've been camping before, I could run scenarios in my head, I could tap into these tools that someone else may not have, means that there were actually some ideas out there that the broader exposure or the more people who are in the room to come up with a solution can then create something that does fit those descriptions of both creativity and innovation. But it's very doable, and it doesn't have to be massively complicated or hugely expensive. But it's like, wow, 15,000 people that otherwise people may have been stressing for another 2 weeks, worrying where they were, and you could solve that problem, right? It's quite doable. And I think that piece is important to kind of drop the temperature a little bit on the pressure we put on ourselves around what is innovation or, coming up with solutions. It's a great example.
Yeah, and in this case, it was a Google form. I mean, it's like super basic, right? I mean, there were some other pieces to it, but sometimes it involves just acting quickly. Like the fact that he led that when he did, like the timing of that was so important. And I am positive he saved lives by setting that system up. Because there were people that they didn't have water and there was no way to get it to them until we figured out where they were. And a couple of days after we did that, I was at a laundromat because we had to go to the next county to do laundry. So I'm at this county, and there was this other woman there, and I could tell she was also not a regular at the laundromat, and we started talking, and sure enough, she's from Asheville, and her entire community was completely cut off because all the roads around her neighborhood, fell into they just fell off the mountain. And the people just got together, like all her neighbors, about 20 of them, and said, well, we're missing this road here. Let's rebuild it. And they rebuilt this road on the side of the mountain. There was enough to get like a light car through. So she was actually at the laundromat doing laundry for her entire neighborhood. And then while we were there, a helicopter came to her neighborhood and was like delivering supplies. And so she gets this text from them that like, the helicopter's landed. And it's just like, oh my gosh, it was so cool. Just this group of people, 20 people were like, hey, we have shovels. Let's build this road. We don't need to sit around and wait for, FEMA or the government or the city or whoever. Let's get going. And so I think sometimes the innovation can be just about the timing of, being willing to take action.
Whether you want to call it preparation, whether you want to call it exposure, whatever it is, just like you had been exposed to camping and what does that look like and what are some of the things we might need to think about that would take for granted if you had never been outside of, the assumption is if I turn the tap on, water will come out, Isn't that a given? The same goes in those elements of in a community coming together, in a collective of people that have something that unites them, that means they step into action when there is a disaster. There were pre-existing conditions that had been created by those people. Like it's not an accident. Even in that community setting, if you had done nothing but make it clear that you would never talk to anyone and there was no connection there at all, that would have taken longer. It may have eventually happened out of necessity, but those pre-existing conditions and what we take time to build in advance of the need to use them is actually, I think, one of those elements when we look at that research and think about the complexity of the world we live in, the speed of change, what we're having to adapt to. I'm finding it interesting, and in the last 18 months, it's been fascinating how many people in their overwhelm and feeling like there is so much they have to do, the pieces they're choosing to put off and say, I will get to that. Like I know it's important, but I don't have time yet. My sense is that you're actually choosing the wrong things that you're working on now, because the very pieces you're saying you'll get to it eventually are foundational and will set you up. Like you're already uncomfortable. This block is going to be yucky, and yes, we're adding in something that you're going to have to learn and you won't be great at it straight away. But are there stories you have or examples you've seen where leaders have been able to take what felt like a risk, to put the time and effort into, getting you or others to teach them these skills, and that you can, share that story a little bit so someone might be able to go, while it feels uncomfortable, it is worth prioritizing this now.
2 weeks ago, I was working with a company, as a manufacturing company who makes like industrial soaps and things like that.
Yeah.
And they were interested in being more efficient in the manufacturing plant. Now, I'll be honest, I think manufacturing is fascinating, but it's not
Yeah.
something I have an expertise in. So we're talking on the phone on Zoom, and I'm asking her a bunch of questions about the problems they're facing. And she says, well, we're just not that efficient. And I said, well, do you have some numbers? Like, she said, well, we're about 50% efficient. And I said, okay, well, what's like the top? I'm sure it's not 100. And she said, no, like a really efficient manufacturing plant would be about 80%. I was like, oh, okay. So there's a pretty wide gap here. And I said, what would happen if you got about 60% efficient? Like, how would that translate into, value dollars? And she
Yeah.
said, oh, we would probably make another $10 million a year. And this is not a big company. This is sort of a, I don't know, medium-sized company. And so anyway, so we did this full day training where I taught them the basics of creativity and some of the principles that I teach in my book. And then we spent the afternoon looking at specific challenges they had. And we went through the creative problem solving process to address those challenges. So at the end of the day, they walked away with ideas that could be potential solutions for these different challenges they had. And I mean, the way I look at it is, okay, they probably had to slow things down for the day while 40 of the people that worked there were with me. And that obviously costs money, plus me being there. And, there's all sorts of small expenses. But at the end of the day, if we could even get 1% more efficient, after slowing down for the day and taking some time to be innovative and coming up with new ideas, I mean, that's just a no-brainer. And granted, it was only a day and they have more work to do to implement all that, but it's almost just, I just feel almost frustrated. I'm like, the return on investment is, exponential.
And that disposition, I suppose, of like taking the approach of understanding from the beginning, like you've used a few words today around pieces like the elements of practice. So ideas like deliberative practice and learning these skills. If you come at this and say, yes, there may be the elements around a workshop or the time that takes or the money that takes, but you take a bigger picture that's saying these are skills that we're trying to learn, practices we're trying to embed in the way we operate around here, which will flow into elements we haven't even thought of yet, right? The repeatability of learning a skill rather than having a consultant who comes in and fixes it for you and just sort of says, do this, do that. To me, the kind of compounding of that over time is what you also need to be thinking about, because there's a lot of consultants charging a fortune who, in my opinion, really aren't adding any value because they don't take the time to understand the context of a business. They come in and kind of do this off-the-shelf answer of like, this is the plug and play response to your problem. And yet what you're talking about there, if we can just shift how we're even looking at it and be a bit more realistic of like, what will it take? But what is the potential here? I think the calming down and slowing down on that approach to it is where you'll then see the massive leap in the benefit you get from this type of thinking.
This morning, I talked with a different location that is also interested in doing the same training. And the guy I was talking to said, we want to standardize innovation. We want this approach you have because we want to standardize it. We want to embed this in the work we're doing all the time. And I think, like making this a repeatable thing, which I think also goes back to a myth around creativity, that it's this like, go with the flow and it's just blah, like, when it comes, it'll come. And like, well, okay, maybe once in a while that's a piece of it, but actually you can build this, deliberate process.
You're so right that that's a myth too, because I think when we've conflated those ideas of like creativity equals an artist, for example, there's still all of the completely made up aspects that are like, oh, well, they're fairies and they just float around and do whatever. And yet any of us who actually know people who are brilliant in those areas, there's an obsessiveness to like where you'd go, that's already beautiful. Why are we throwing that out and starting again? Like, please stop. But we dismiss that because it's been put in a category that isn't seen as this like robust, rigorous form of mastery. And yet actually all of those pieces, whether it's the music, the art, any of them are the perfect examples of obsession to the point of like, oh, good Lord, aren't you bored? Like there's nothing fun about, you've played that same piece of music 150 times in a row. I'm sick of hearing it. Like surely you've had enough. And so those pieces too, even just coming back to the realization that we repeat and have an approach to some elements, but then we're just not being fair on the fact that like, well, to get mastery requires that deliberative practice. It's just part of it.
Yeah. It's like the pursuit of mastery.
I remember saying to someone once when there was kind of that element of pushback around, well, you had to do this kind of training piece to learn these skills. And then when I was saying, in order to actually get the results though, there's a minimum time period where I'll do, say, I talk about it as more of that customized implementation coaching, like supporting you to implement it. Because I don't want to run a workshop and then go, good luck with that, because like, how's that going to work? The problems fall, doesn't matter how well we design something, we will be wrong when it hits the real. And there's kind of this piece of, well, but we've already done the workshop or we've already paid to do this. Like, why do we have to do it again? And it's like, okay, I drank water yesterday. I still have to drink it today. I had a shower yesterday. You can't say, well, the shower was not worth having because it turns out I have to do it again. Like there's a complete weird, your logic doesn't stack up in the way you do anything else. And yet we don't think really, do we?
It's so true. I mean, it's kind of like, just because you played soccer once doesn't mean you're never going to play again. Like, no, you want to get good at it. You keep playing. And hopefully you're finding joy and value in that process. I mean, I personally enjoy taking showers. Several a week is ideal.
Yeah. And even more so now that you appreciate not having running water.
Exactly. Yeah. So I do think we forget that, learning anything takes repetition. It takes time. That there's a feedback process if we want to improve, and creativity is the same. Yeah. It's a skill.
Have you found that when we dig into that element that we've just touched on around this comfort with not being already exceptional, not being someone who's mastered an element, are there pieces or ways that you've been able to talk to leaders that have helped them push through some of that discomfort and actually put themselves in the position of being a novice again to learn these things? Because for a lot of people, they have for probably decades been used to being the top performer, the person who's got it all together, the one that people look to for the answers, and admitting or putting yourself intentionally into a position where you have no clue can be deeply uncomfortable for people.
Yeah, that's really true. That is a good point. Have you read Adam Grant's book, Hidden Potential? There's a section in there where he's talking about people who are, trying, like polyglots who know a bunch of languages, right? And he shares the story of a couple of people that he highlights who really struggled learning languages growing up. And as adults, they still only knew one language. Mm-hmm. And the key that he talks about is if you want to learn a new language, you have to be willing to look stupid, look dumb, look, whatever, because
incompetent.
You have to, exactly. And the ideal, of course, is you go to a country of the language. If I want to learn Spanish, I go to a Spanish-speaking country, and I'm just going to make mistake after mistake after mistake. And if you're willing to do that, you can become pretty dang fluent in about 6 months. And that has really stuck with me, in part because I've tried many times to learn Spanish. And I've gotten okay, but I haven't been around it enough.
Yeah.
But I think one of the keys and one of the things leaders can think about when they're trying to learn, kind of in that space of being a novice, is what can you do that's low risk? Yeah, and so, I think of okay, learning a language is probably pretty low risk to go talk to somebody at the grocery store as you're in the checkout line and try to speak Spanish with them versus, I'm going to give a keynote speech in Spanish, right? Like that's high risk. Okay.
That sounds like something I'd do. Oh yeah, let's just jump straight from 0 to 100. Yeah.
Right. And so thinking about, okay, as a leader, what can you do? If you want to work on being more creative together, are there small things you could do? Maybe a 5 to 10 minute segment in a team meeting every week, or let's just for this week, we're going to try this one thing, or, setting it up so that it's a really small piece. And then, and also saying like, hey, I don't know if this is going to work. And so you're just sort of like putting out this disclaimer, then
That
it
piece is
gives you an
really
out.
important. Yeah.
Yeah, because it gives you an out. If you're like, well, all right, y'all, we tried this for a month and it is not working. I think we
Yeah.
need to adjust.
And the thing that you can do when you've set that, like in my mind, this is all about the setting of expectations. Because if you go out there and either to your team or whoever it is that you're interacting with, so whoever that stakeholder is, if you frame it as, I'm already an expert in this and I've got this all covered, and then you crash and burn, well, that's your fault for setting yourself up as knowing what you were doing. But there is the playfulness and the de-risking elements of it. A big part of that is in the setup and the expectation setting and the framing of what this is and being honest and vulnerable about, okay, I don't know what I'm doing here. But in fact, I always find that people respect you more for that and kind of go, oh, good Lord, I can't believe you're brave enough to do that.
And I actually think that it's really a sign of good leadership if
Oh, I do
you're
too.
willing to say you don't know. I mean, I have a lot of distrust of the leaders who come across as like, oh, I've got this all figured out and I know everything and just trust me. And no, that's just ego. And that's not going to end up being good leadership.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's in the same way, like when we think about that element of setting up expectations or how things then play out on the back of that. The elements you told in the story of, okay, ringing your daughter and saying, fill up the bathtub and fill up the water bottles and different pieces. All of the things that you then do on the back of the approach you take to it are the pieces that will frame the types of results you get out of it. So it's sort of willingness to just try something. And yes, guess what? Maybe you didn't fill up enough things, or maybe you forgot 3 elements, but you did some of it and you're still better off than if you did none. And I think there's that piece that comes with being willing to be a novice and not be perfect.
Yeah.
That means you don't then beat yourself up for the things you forgot or the things you didn't do, but it's like, I'm still in a better position than if I had done none of it. Yeah. If it was, well, unless we all had the shared app with the 17 points that had all been ticked off, we're not doing anything. It's like, okay, let's lower the bar.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, doing something is better than nothing, usually.
You talk about shared purpose, strong team dynamics, and then the creative process. And you've touched a bit on the creative process and you running workshops and different elements. But what do we need to know about the role of and the power of that element around shared purpose to be able to come at this conversation effectively?
The 3 elements come from my dissertation research that I did a few years ago that identified what do teams need if they want to be creative together. So team purpose, team dynamics, and team creative process. And so team purpose meaning, does the team have a shared purpose? Do they all know what the team purpose is? Do they all understand it? Do they buy into it? I would say, a lot of teams have this figured out. But not all. And sometimes it surprised me who doesn't have it figured out. So for instance, like the marketing team, okay, we probably know like the marketing team's job is to market the product or the service or whatever it is. Although it's still good to have a conversation, like what specifically is our purpose here. But I had a situation a few years ago where I was consulting with an executive team of an insurance company. And I don't even remember what prompted this, to be honest. But in the middle of our session, I asked the team, I said, what's your team purpose? And they kind of looked at each other, and then one of them said, oh, do you mean like our mission statement? I said, well, that's more of the company's purpose. But this team, like, why do you all meet every other week? What's your purpose? And, they really couldn't answer the question. So then we obviously had some work to do. So I think having conversations within the team to figure out like what exactly is our purpose together is really helpful. Sometimes the leader will be very clear on the purpose, but the team members won't, or sometimes vice versa.
There's an assumption that it is clear because it's intuitive to the leader and hasn't been made explicit. Yeah.
Yeah. And so getting that clarity, it can help. For one, can be a huge motivator, and that people understand like, oh, this is what I'm committing to. This, in fact, now I'm even more willing to commit to this team because I understand what this is about and I really buy into it.
For you, is that team purpose, does it is part of what makes us then feel more committed to the team or more motivated to do our work. Is it about not only describing, okay, who we are as a team, but making explicit that connection between in us operating in this way, it contributes to the broader organization's purpose or mission statement or whatever the language is that you use in your company? Is part of its effectiveness the direct tying our actions or our team's results to the greater good of the company?
I think so. Yeah, I think that that's really helpful, because if it feels disconnected, then it might feel like, why are we doing this?
What's the point?
Yeah, what's the point? And I think that many people are motivated by that sense of purpose, that higher purpose that's outside of ourselves. That really can drive our intrinsic motivation. And, if I feel like, oh, by going to work today, I'm going to help somebody else, or I'm going to do good in the world, that's pretty motivating versus like, I'm just going to go to work today and it doesn't really matter to anybody else. That's like the opposite. It's demotivating,
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that connection is really key. Team dynamics. This is basically how the teams interact with each other.
Yeah.
And what's particularly important is that there's at least a moderate to high level of trust, that we can engage in conflict together, but kind of a moderate amount. Like, we want to be able to disagree around the ideas and the concepts, but we don't want to disagree necessarily around like people's identity or who they are. There's kind of like a sweet spot there with the conflict. Not too much, not too little. So trust, conflict, and then communication. That's probably obvious that, obviously the team members need to be able to communicate with each other well, and also communicate outside the team. Teams can get a bit too insular, and that can have a negative impact on creativity. But yeah, the team needs to be able to essentially collaborate with each other.
When you work through these, is it a sequence? Like, is it we need to work on making sure there's clarity on the purpose, then we build to looking at how we're operating from a team dynamics perspective? Or is it kind of there's a bunch of tools and ways that you're getting people to think about them all in the one kind of conversation? How does that play out?
So visually, I represent this model in a Venn diagram, which you've seen, but just for people that haven't seen, probably for anybody who's online, this is what it looks like. I'll just hold that up.
But yeah, and we will share links. You can head out to the website and have a look at bits and pieces. Yeah,
yeah. I think it varies team to team as to where you start. As far as the three elements. And I actually have an assessment scale that I created that measures those three elements in teams. And that can be really helpful when a team wants to really get serious about being deliberate creative. And then, because they might find like, well, this scale shows that you all are rocking the team purpose, so we don't even need to go there. I mean, we'll talk about it for 5 minutes and let's move on. Or, wow, everything is great except team purpose. I will say most of the work that I end up doing is around creative process. It's the area that most teams are weakest in. And mostly it's because they just don't know anything about it. I think there are, countless books around purpose. Simon Sinek's popularized that with Start With Why. And even many others. And same thing with team dynamics. And so those are just, I think, much more part of our...
Yeah, sort of familiar, even if it's that you've listened to a TED Talk or a podcast or read a book here or there. You're right. There's some elements that you're probably familiar with.
Yeah, exactly. And then team creative process just isn't known as well. And so I end up spending a lot of time with teams around that.
And probably, I would guess, having to do a bunch of the unlearning and defining things that we did at the beginning of this conversation of kind of going, I'm not talking about, are you an artist? I'm not talking about just having disconnected random brainstorming sessions that lead to nothing, having to almost do the justification up front of connecting for people why this sits in your category of novelty that is valuable. Like, this is relevant for you guys. I'm not asking you to do something that is a distraction. I've had a number of people over the years in the work that I do trying to combine these aspects of merging money and meaning and getting them to realize that actually you can create this beautiful self-reinforcing loop where it's better for the business long term and also is having a positive impact in the world. And so often there's just these unconscious beliefs that are there and not even questioned for people where they'll say, yeah, that's really great. We have to get clear on our strategy first and then we'll come and like, this is always like the separate piece and everything you're describing in that creative process too. It's saying, oh no, I don't want you to add on this nice little thing that you do on Fridays at lunchtime with the team. I'm saying
Right.
change the fundamental way you work and make decisions and come up with the strategy in the first place. It's like
Yeah.
interesting how we've pushed to being not relevant or not business-like. Such
Mhm.
human, critical skills.
I don't know. It was just kind of, we're in this place of like capitalism gone awry or something where we're just like too focused on that financial gain. But that's not ultimately the purpose of business. I mean, it is an important element of it.
Yeah. And it even historically never was. It's this funny thing. We act as if it's a given and you're like, okay, it came in the 70s. All the evidence demonstrates it hasn't achieved what it promised you it would. And it's not the
Yeah.
roots of business. It's not how we deeply, go back to trading and bartering and all these things that are deeply human that we're
Yeah.
about, craftspersonship and, okay, what am I good at? And it's really a divide and conquer piece that's no different to your story of the woman in the laundromat doing everyone. That's like, okay, you go and do everyone's laundry. This person's, their garden's still functioning, so they're going to pick us all some vegetables. This person, that's what business is.
Yeah.
It's like, what is it that each of us bring to the table? You talked about you've got the sort of assessment tool, which I think is really helpful to not just say every single organization has to spend 3 weeks on this piece, even if they're good at it. And but how do we identify where we have some of those skill gaps that we should focus?
Yeah.
But you also have your cards, the Climer cards. And I have looked at them on the website and read some of your bits and pieces. I must admit, I haven't got them myself, so I haven't used them in a session. But I really loved, again, the creation of a tool that makes it practical and usable in sessions or in meetings with your team. Can you talk to us a little bit about why you created them and how you found those useful as almost part of that embedding it in the practice of how we do things, not just a one-off workshop? What are those
Yeah.
cards and how have they helped? Because I know it's something like, is it 100,000 participants in sessions so far? And so you had some pretty impressive numbers of like people across the world using those cards. So can you tell us a little bit about that? And we will share a link to the cards.
Sure.
But I think
Yeah,
that might be
absolutely.
a practical way to kind of bring this into the category of, if this is interesting to you, what would be an easy step to start to play with some of these
Yeah.
ideas?
Okay, so these are Climer cards. If you're on video, you can see the box. But basically what they are, they're about the size of they are the size of a deck of regular playing cards. There's 52 images, 52 cards, and each card has a different image. These are all little paintings that I did that the images are designed to like spark metaphors and help people create connections between different concepts or just help them communicate at a deeper level with each other. So the way it works, there's a number of different ways to use them. So I'll explain two really simple ways. So one is you take all the cards and you just spread them out on the table so everybody can see them. Like let's say you're in a team meeting, and then you ask a question, and the question or the prompt is really where that's the part you want to just give a little thought to as a leader.
Mm.
And you want to ask a question based on what do you want to talk about? So let's say you're starting off a conversation within your team about being more creative together. And so you lay all the cards out and you say, select a card that represents why you think creativity matters in our team. And then everybody picks a card. And just for those of you who aren't on video, it could be like there's some tulips, there's a mountain, a butterfly, a sack of groceries, a little spiral. Like there's all these different images. And then everyone picks their image, and then you can go around and share. Or if it's a bigger group, you might break into smaller groups to share. And each person shares like why they picked that card and how does it answer the question.
Mm.
And what happens is that people end up saying different things than they would have said without the cards.
Yeah.
And they tend to go deeper, they get more specific, more focused. Like if you had just asked the team, why do you think it's important that we become more creative? People are
Mm.
going to spout some stuff out.
Yeah.
But this helps them like just get more clear and more specific.
It's almost that tapping into different parts of your brain too, isn't it? Of like the imagery or the in the moment, particularly if people aren't comfortable talking in front of the group or, their mind goes blank. There's something about in seeing an image, you make a connection or
Yes.
you suddenly are able to, as you said, articulate or tap into, oh, I hadn't even realized how important that was to me or what that looked like. And then our brains too, the imagery will stay with us longer than something else will. Because I have a bunch of photos and images that I do a similar piece in workshops. And I found it fascinating. I did a session recently where it was over a few days, and even at the end, people were still pointing to each other and saying, you know, when you showed that picture of the surfboards and talked about the tools we needed, this is one of those tools. So people were connecting it back to the image each other shared, and it kind of made the ideas of the other people in the room stick in each of their minds, because now it wasn't just that someone was just ranting about their vision for the company. It was like, oh, the surfboards, the tool, you know, like I think so often we haven't really, as you said at the beginning, been taught to tap into this thing and go, I can come up with different ideas by having these prompts, a question, an image.
Yeah, and I think you're spot on that like the visuals help our brain think a little different. And then that last thing you said is connects to the other technique that I often use. And there's like, you know, people have come up with all sorts of ways to use the cards, which is also kind of fun. But I am a fan of avoiding brainstorming, actually. It's not a very effective tool. There's some other things that are a little better. And I also think it's really helpful when you're in that ideation phase, you're trying to come up with new ideas, to use some different techniques. And so one of the techniques that I use is laying the Climer cards out on the table and then asking the group, use these images to spark more ideas. You know, what ideas do you get from these images? And it doesn't matter. They don't even have to know why. It could just be that maybe a color sparks something, or like this is a flamingo in a spotlight. And it's like, I don't know, maybe this sparks something about getting up on stage or
visibility and
right. Or, I mean, it could be anything. It doesn't even matter. But that's another way that can be fun to use the deck.
People listening to this or watching this could take that idea as a way to practice being in that space of being a novice and not having to only say the clever ideas that end up being implemented. You know, the having these tools, one of the tools we use in that same vein is the business model canvas, and it frames all of the work we do. And I had someone recently who joined me for a workshop, and I didn't recognize them, and they said, oh, I did a business modeling workshop with you guys about 10 years ago, and I still have nightmares about at one point I had done this beautiful business model, and you guys had this piece that you did where we had to then walk up to the front and put it through the paper shredder. And I was like, oh my gosh, but it was so beautiful. And one of my team members, Isaac, used to do that in all of his sessions. And it was that piece, because we kept saying to people, this is a tool, like you can put an idea down, scrunch it up and throw it in the bin. It doesn't matter. Like, learn to trust yourself that you'll build on these ideas. But I loved that this poor woman was like, I still remember having to shred my business model canvas. I was like, I apologize that we traumatized you. These pieces of realizing that the tools are freeing you up to go, okay, that's one scenario. I'm not going to just fall in love with the first idea and build that. Or if someone points out why it wouldn't work, that means I'm embarrassed and never going to suggest something to the group again. So using the Climer cards in that way to, even as a group, take a not too risky step into experimenting with the that creative practice, I think is a great idea.
Yeah. And I think what's one fun thing about using them is that like no one's experienced in it.
Yes.
Right.
True.
Like, I mean,
it's a level playing field.
Right. Like if you bring these to your team, like chances are no one will have used them before.
Yeah.
I mean, every once in a while, someone will be like, oh, I've used those once, but it doesn't matter. Like everyone's going to, you know,
well, they still don't know the questions that are being driven in that session, or like you can't prepare for that session of like, okay, I'm going to put all the deck out and I'm already going to choose my.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So, and one of the things that I am very proud of with the cards is they seem to be working really well cross-culturally, which was a goal of mine. So I created these in 2012, and they've been used in 57 countries that I know of, which I get so excited about. But that was something, and that's sort of the nice thing, is because there aren't any words on them, that, you know, there are images that are mostly work everywhere. There's actually a company in Australia that sells them.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
I'll get you to share that with me. Although people can just get them from your website directly.
They can, yeah. Although if you are in Australia, I would definitely recommend going to the company. They're
Okay.
called Playmeo
Okay.
because you're going to get them so much quicker.
The other piece I did notice was that one of the elements you've added in with the cards is an ability to use them in online meetings. Given COVID, I mean, so many elements of the designerly aspects of how we operate in our business, it was so tricky because we went from being very full on about having to be face to face, and all of my work required me to get on a plane, and then COVID hit. We're in Melbourne, 264 days of lockdown. We had the longest lockdowns in the world. It was crazy.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I'm curious, just briefly, for you to tell us, how have people responded to using these in that online meeting format? Because I haven't done that before, and I would be curious to see how that's playing out.
Yeah, it works really well. In some cases, I like the online format better. And I've actually
Mm.
even used the online version for
In
in-person
an
sessions.
in-person session? Okay.
Yeah, and just said everyone pull out your phone and put a QR code up and everyone respond.
And so what the cards, they almost like flick through the options and select something, or how does it work?
Yeah, so the way it works is that the facilitator in advance would put the prompt in the screen.
Okay.
And then when everyone goes there, they see the prompt and then they see all the cards. They're all on the screen at once. Or, if you're on a phone, you might scroll a little more.
Yeah.
And then whatever card you want, you click on it, you put in your name, and then you write a sentence or two of why you chose that card. And that's the value, one of the values of the
Oh,
uh,
because
online
got that
version.
data.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see everybody's response. You can
Mm,
create a report afterwards, either a PDF or Excel spreadsheet. And there's just a lot of other little features within the online version. And because it's just a website, you don't have to download anything. You can use it
yeah,
with Zoom or Teams or whatever app you're on. So yeah, there's been a really positive response to that. It's quite
that's
nice.
great. So to kind of recap for people, so your book, Deliberate Creative Teams, How to Lead for Innovative Results, that's coming out in February, but we are going to share a link. The cards are available now,
Mhm.
and your TEDx talk is also something that people could watch. Oh, and your podcast, obviously. Is there something that you want to kind of leave with us as we wrap up, or an element that you want to point people to in your work that kind of brings us home, Amy?
So if anyone wants a resource of especially how to apply some of the things we've learned on my website, which is climerconsulting.com, and Climer is spelled Climer. So if you go there and click on Insights, which is the podcast, the blogs, there's all sorts of free stuff on there related to different episodes. There's a workbook around team creative the team creative process. If you are looking for something in particular, feel free to just email me. You can email me right through the website.
And are you on LinkedIn? Are you active on LinkedIn? Like, is LinkedIn a good place for people to connect with you as well?
Yeah, that's actually a really good place. I'm quite active on LinkedIn, so
Great.
that's a good starting point. And I would just say, like, just get out there and try this stuff.
Yeah.
The motto that I have developed from all this work is be deliberate to be creative. It'll work if you work it. If you
Yeah.
don't, well, it won't work. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And so maybe sort of doing a little bit of a dance between looking at the website, digging into some of these pieces to get a level of familiarity, but then remembering the piece we said about just stepping in as an equal level playing field with your team, not presenting yourself as the expert at this, but being open and saying, we're going to experiment, we're going to figure this out together. And there'll be messy elements that we won't get great, but we're never going to get good at it if we don't try, I think, is probably a helpful point to start with.
Exactly. Yeah. Well said.
Thank you so much, Amy. And I really hope that there's been some little nuggets in this that people can pick up. And as Amy mentioned, we'll share links to all of the elements we've talked about today. Please explore that, get in touch with Amy. And whether it's the cards or definitely get the book in February when that comes out, I think this is an area that is a no-brainer for all of us as business leaders to be bringing into our work more. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Bessie.